Hello and welcome to our 10th class on the book of Ecclesiastes during lockdown in the UK, and as some restrictions are now being lifted. The class was taught on Tuesday, the 2nd of June, 2020, for the British Bible School in a Zoom class setting. As we examine Ecclesiastes, the outline we've been looking at is this one, and right now we are in the third section, where Solomon is contrasting wisdom and foolishness. But before we get into chapter 10, let's have a look at just a quick review of the first 9 chapters. In chapter 1, Solomon exclaimed that life basically is meaningless, utterly meaningless. Everything's meaningless. So he begins to search for a meaning in life. What is it that makes life worth living? And he looks at a number of things in chapters 2 through 6, case studies as we've been calling them. And in these, he examines every aspect of life. And as people try to find what makes their life worth living, what gives them meaning in life, these are the very things that we look at today. So it's well worth us looking at these. The thing is, as he looked at various things, wealth and fame and work, and the list goes on, he always arrived at the same conclusion. This, he says, is meaningless. Chapter 7, we saw a difference, and he starts looking into the difference between wisdom and foolishness. Solomon, of course, being a very, very wise man. So what's the difference? Is there an advantage to having wisdom? And he's looked at various things, and he has discovered that as a whole, wisdom is better. But he's also discovered wisdom can't answer all the questions that we may have. It just is not equipped to do that. We also saw a case study there at the end of chapter 9 that you can be wise, but because you're poor, you have no position, you'll be ignored. And he says this too is meaningless. At the end of chapter 9, Derek Kidner, in his commentary, The Message of Ecclesiastes, had this to say. At last, Koheleth, and Koheleth is the Hebrew word for the preacher or the teacher, at last Koheleth has finished his work of demolition. The site has been cleared. He can turn to building and planting. Whether we regard the next chapter, that is chapter 10, as the modest beginning of this process, or as an interlude to relieve the tension, it will allow us to get our breath before reverting to the burning question of the book, whether life has any point, and if so, what it is. For a start, then, there are matters of common sense for us to notice, which are as much a part of wisdom and sound living as are the questions we must face at the boundaries of our knowledge. We steady ourselves with reminders to be sensible, chapter 10, so that we may launch out more surely upon the call to be bold, joyful, and godly, which we're going to see in chapters 11 and 12. So in our last section of contrasting wisdom and foolishness, we're going to be looking at the need to be sensible, and he shows us by showing what's right with wisdom and what's wrong with foolishness. We're going to look at this in 2 sections. The first section we'll look at, the first half of this chapter, we're going to see wisdom helps a person to succeed. Wisdom gives us success. Lack of wisdom gives us failure. And so we're going to see those 2 things. He'll continue in verse 12 talking about fools, but then the last part of that last section, he'll talk about kings. And so we're going to have a look at all these various aspects. So let's get into chapter 10 as he begins to look at the need to be sensible. And this first section, as we said, wisdom helps a person to succeed. Starting in verse 1. As dead flies give perfume a bad smell, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. The heart of the wise inclines to the right, but the heart of the fool to the left. Even as fools walk along the road, they lack sense and show everyone how stupid they are. If a ruler's anger rises against you, do not leave your post. Calmness can lay great offenses to rest. There is an evil I have seen under the sun, the sort of error that arises from a ruler. Fools are put in many high positions, while the rich occupy the low ones. I have seen slaves on horseback, while princes go on foot like slaves. Whoever digs a pit may fall into it. Whoever breaks through a wall may be bitten by a snake. Whoever quarries stones may be injured by them. Whoever splits logs may be endangered by them. If the axe is dull and its edge unsharpened, more strength is needed, but skill will bring success. If a snake bites before it is charmed, the charmer receives no fee. So as he concludes examining wisdom and foolishness, this chapter is largely a series of proverbs. I think you can see that as we read through that text there. He starts with one that may be a bit humorous to us. Dead flies makes ointment smell bad. Yes, and just as that is true, he says, so a little foolishness will outweigh wisdom and honor. The Net Bible Study Note says that the idea is not that a little folly is more valuable than much wisdom, but that a little folly can have more influence than great wisdom. It only takes one little mistake to ruin a life of great wisdom. Think about that. It takes far less to ruin something than it does to create it, doesn't it? It's far easier to tear down than to build up. It can take a year or so to build a house. But, you get a wrecking ball, you get an earthquake, you get a tornado coming through, and what it took a long time to build up can be torn down in mere minutes. It's far easier to tear down than it is to build up. And by the way, I'm quite confident that has spiritual applications as we live our lives as Christians as well. And of course, he said there, it's easier to make a stink than to create sweetness. I don't think flies have that capability. Hendry in the New Bible Commentary said, wisdom is excellent, but it is at a disadvantage in comparison with folly, which produces disproportionately large effects. A little leaven of folly can vitiate a whole lump of wisdom, and a single fool can undo the work of many wise men. I don't know about you, vitiate is not one of the words in my vocabulary, so I had to look it up. And the idea is vitiate is something that influences in a negative way. And we realize that a little leaven leavens the whole lump, and he's adapted that by saying a little leaven of folly can influence a whole lump of wisdom. A single fool undo the work of many wise men. And he goes on to talk about the wise and the foolish. He says, the heart of the wise inclines to the right, but the heart of the fool to the left. Now, this is not a political statement at all. This is something of, and probably was a proverb that they said back then. The Net Bible tries to make some sense of it and sort of interprets it a bit, and it does make some sense, and translated it this way: a wise person's good sense protects him. A fool's lack of sense leaves him vulnerable. And I think that's the idea behind the Hebrew words here. The Jerusalem Bible put it this way: the wise man's heart leads him aright, the fool's heart leads him astray. And maybe that's the way we would say that today. The Net Bible Study Notes went on to explain what's going on here by talking about the right and the left. It says, in the Hebrew, it literally is a wise man's heart is at his right hand. The phrase right hand is a Hebrew idiom for the place of protection. He cites 3 verses from Psalms that show that. In ancient warfare, the shield of the warrior on one's right-hand side protected one's right hand. Koheleth's point is that wisdom provides protection. And that seems to be the point that he's making here. Denny Petrillo, in the Truth for Today commentary, wrote this: right represents what is good, logical, and strong in many cultures. Left has for centuries stood for that which is evil, illogical, or weak. So I think that makes sense now. The wise to the right and the foolish to the left. Of course, as Christians, we need to be living wise lives, don't we? Paul spelled it out slightly differently when he wrote to the Philippians. What he wrote was this: finally, brothers and sisters, whatever's true, whatever's noble, whatever's right, whatever's pure, whatever's lovely, whatever's admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. I think we can see if we can live a life like this as a Christian, we will be living a wise life, one that's excellent, one that is praiseworthy. But back to the fool. He says, even when a fool walks on the road, he lacks sense, showing to everyone that he is what he is. He's a fool. And I'm sure we've seen people like this who, just walking down the street, will do foolish things and sometimes dangerous things that might get them injured. The only way for a fool not to give himself away seems to be total silence. Solomon, when he wrote the Proverbs, talked about the fool in many of the Proverbs. One of them that reflects upon this is Proverbs 17, verse 28. Even fools are thought wise if they keep silent, and discerning if they hold their tongues. Yeah, if you don't open your mouth, you're not going to show people whether you're wise or foolish, are you? But Derek Kidner went on to say that even then, if he's trying to be silent, his general bearing would probably give him away. But in fact, he's too full of himself to refrain from airing his views to everyone he meets. And therein is the problem, isn't it? When a fool's walking down the street, he thinks he's got to comment on everything and everything that somebody says. And by opening his mouth, he shows exactly what he is. Maybe the lesson for us sometimes is to learn to be quiet. He moves on to talk about dealing with those who are our rulers. He says, if a ruler gets mad at you, the best thing to do is to stay put and don't react. Calmness, he says, will lay even great offenses to rest. Learn to be calm, learn not to react. Now, Bible Study Notes points out that this could have one of several meanings. It says that the point is either, one, that a composed response can calm or appease the anger of the ruler, and that does seem to be what he's saying there, or two, a calm heart will help one avoid great sins that would offend the king. And I think that's a true statement as well. It goes on to point out that in Hebrew, what we have here is a word play. The root of the Hebrew word to rest is found in the words to leave and to avoid. And you can see, I think, in what printed out there, that the Hebrew there of to rest is found at the beginning of to leave, or do not leave, and the beginning of avoid. So rather than leaving, rather than resigning, composure can appease a king, cause the anger of the king to live. And that may be the idea there that we can, or the wordplay there, that we can don't leave, instead cause the anger of the king to leave. I think that makes some sense there. Derek Kidner wrote that there is a keen observation behind the quiet advice of verse 4. For what we are invited to notice is that rather absurd human phenomenon, the huff. If one can recognize its symptoms, one will be saved some self-inflicted damage. For while it may feel magnificent to resign your post, as the NEB translates it, ostensibly on principle, but actually in a fit of pride, it is in fact less impressive, more immature than it feels. And I think he makes a good point there. So often we do go off in a huff, don't we? So often we think out of principle, yes, I will leave, I will resign. How many people do that in politics? And while it might feel great, look, we've made a stand, why are we really doing it? Is it not just because our advice has been rejected or we've been corrected in some way? As he says, it's less impressive, more immature than it feels. I've seen Christians throughout my life, when somebody gets up to speak and either they say something they don't like or they don't like the person, get up, make a big show of it, and walk out. They'd leave. But does that really show maturity? Or does that show how immature they are? I've seen some do it where they get up and walk out and everybody thought they were sick and didn't understand why they left. And they thought they were making a statement, but instead people were wondering what was wrong with them. So yeah, I think Derek Kidner makes a good point there. You know, it's interesting if you think about our society. Our society does not like to go along with those who are in authority. Going against the given rules and guidelines seems to be the default position of our society at times. But you know, as Christians, we are to live differently. We are to be submissive to those who are in authority. Both Paul and Peter wrote about the need to not only pray for those who govern us, but also to obey the laws. And you know, we seem to be quick to observe if it disagrees with God that we don't have to obey them. But sometimes we seem to do that and then don't obey them when it's not disagreeing with anything God has said. I think sometimes we need to emphasize that the default position of a Christian should be obedience, not dwelling on the exceptions. I think we're seeing some of that in this current lifting of the lockdown in the UK. Because as people get some freedoms, it seems to me they're taking a lot more than what's been given, both in Scotland, where we are in phase 1, in England, they're in step 1 or step 2, I forget where they are in England just now. So we need to obey the guidelines, and that's very important. And by the way, one of the guidelines right now is we are not permitted to worship. Why? Because we might infect each other with the coronavirus. It's very simple. It's for our own protection. Now, they're not telling us don't worship. They're telling us we can't gather to worship. And I don't know about you, but for the last 10 weeks or so, we have been worshiping with Christians every Sunday. Sometimes on Zoom, sometimes on YouTube, as we are part of the British Bible School message. But we've been able to be with Christians from throughout the country. Arlene and I every Sunday break bread together. Nobody's outlawed worshiping God. It's just right now we cannot assemble. By the way, right now we can only get together with people outside anyway, out of doors. So we couldn't meet in a building to begin with. And it's in Scotland, it's only to be 2 households together. In England, I think they're allowed a bit more, but in England, they're limited to 6 people. In Scotland, 2 households limited to 8, and it's got to be outdoors. So there's no way we could meet legally in a building. But you know, we can worship, and we need to continue worshiping. Derek Kidner, in the message of Ecclesiastes, wrote, "To be submissive to an autocratic master is not only a believer's duty, as the New Testament has taught us, but may also be his wisdom, since the anger that can be mollified by deference has itself the symptoms of a huff. and one person in that state is better than two. He's suggesting that possibly it's the ruler, the king, that's in the huff, and so we best not join him in another huff. Better to be only one in that, and we can mollify him by acting calmly. Solomon then observes a great evil, which, by the way, came from rulers. They elevated foolish people while subduing those who had resources, those who were the rich. Now, it's not saying that the rich are the ones that need to be elevated, but often the rich are able to do a lot more. And maybe that's what he's saying there. But he says that he has seen those who were slaves riding the horses while princes walked on the ground like slaves. It seems to be talking there about the least qualified enjoying the best that life had to offer. And he goes on to talk about things that we may do, and he may be describing the foolish here. If someone digs a pit, they fall into it. Or if they break through a wall, they'll stick their hand through before checking out what was there, they'll get bitten by a snake. Now, the sense in the Hebrew words here, I think the NIV translates this well, but the sense is not that this will happen. The sense is that it may happen. If someone digs a pit, they might fall into it if they're not careful. If they break through a wall and they're not being careful, they could get bitten by a snake who happened to be made its home there in the wall. They need to check out what's there beforehand. If they quarried stones, they could get hurt. If they split logs, they might be in danger from the very logs that they're splitting. If you ever split logs, you know they can come back on you when you hit them. So these are things that could happen. The idea here, I think Denny Petrillo has the right idea. He wrote, even seemingly simple tasks that are often performed ought to be approached with caution. Wisdom should be exercised. If a worker has not considered possible trouble, he has not used all of the resources, wisdom, common sense, available to him. Therefore, if an accident takes place, who's to blame? Well, he is, because he failed to exercise caution and to prepare for possible difficulties. We need to assess the situation. We need to analyze whether there's danger involved. We need to work through it and see if there's something that we can do to make it safer. Of course, sometimes when we do tasks that we do over and over again, we forget to use caution because we've done it so many times. And when that happens, sometimes we injure ourselves. He goes on, taking this analogy of the axe. He says, if someone's using an axe and it's blunt, they don't sharpen the edge. You know, it's a lot harder to get the axe to go through the wood. It takes a lot more strength. I know several of us used to meet up at a place in the Lake District of England called Seldom Seen to go fell walking. And when we did, there was a wood-burning stove there, but they didn't supply wood. So we either brought our own, or we could scour around the woods that surrounded the row of houses there, and any wood that was on the ground we were free to take and burn. But a lot of times they were too big for the stove. Now, they had an axe there, but we discovered very quickly it was a blunt axe, and we didn't have anything to sharpen it with. So it took a lot of strength to be able to break up the wood with that axe. But that's what Solomon's saying here. If you're using a dull axe, you're going to take a whole lot more effort to get it done. He goes on in the very end of verse 10. He says, but skill brings success. I think that's the point of what's going on here. That the skill we need to bring success is encapsulated in wisdom. It's wisdom that helps a person to succeed. If he has wisdom, he would check the axe before he used it to make sure it was sharp. And then he ends with another little proverb. After all, If the snake bites the charmer before it's charmed, there's no advantage for the charmer, as the NIV put it. The charmer receives no fee. If the charmer is trying to get it to capture a snake, and I guess that's why you would hire a snake charmer, if he ends up getting bit before he gets the snake charmed, I don't think he's going to get paid for what he's doing. He's failing, and the snake would probably get away. We need to use wisdom in all that we do. As we move on to verse 12, the first few verses he's going to talk about fools. The last few verses he's going to talk about kings. So let's read through this section here. Words from the mouth of the wise are gracious, but fools are consumed by their own lips. At the beginning their words are folly, at the end they are wicked madness, and fools multiply words. No one knows what is coming. Who can tell someone else what will happen after them? The toil of fools wearies them. They do not know the way to town. Woe to the land whose king was a servant, and whose princes feast in the morning. Blessed is the land whose king is of noble birth, and whose princes eat at a proper time, for strength and not for drunkenness. Through laziness the rafters sag. Because of idle hands the house leaks. A feast is made for laughter. Wine makes life merry, and money's the answer for everything. Do not revile the king even in your thoughts, or curse the rich in your bedroom, because a bird in the sky may carry your words, and a bird on the wing may report what you say. He starts here talking about the speech of the wise and fools. He says that what a wise man says will be gracious, and as a result will win him favor. And the Hebrew word there means grace and favor both there. But the fool doesn't do that, does he? What the fool says, he says, will consume him. They're consumed by what they say. Net Bible translates it that it's self-destructive. What the fool says gets him into trouble. As Solomon puts it there, when a fool speaks, he begins with foolishness. He ends with wicked madness. And he doesn't know when to stop. A fool speaks and speaks and speaks, even though no one knows what will happen or what the future holds. And he said something similar about no one knowing the future before, hasn't he? Think about a fool when he speaks, as Warren Wiersbe put it in Be Satisfied. He says the fool blurts out whatever's on his mind and doesn't stop to consider who might be hurt by it. In the end, it is the fool himself who is hurt the most. A fool is consumed by his own lips. Derek Kidner said that the little portrait of the fool likewise hints at the inner attitudes that underlie his words. In Scripture, the fool is wrong-headed rather than dull. His thinking, and therefore his speaking, refuses to begin with God. Verse 13, in fact, makes this clear, spanning the whole process from its foolish start to its disastrous end. And that's the problem, isn't it? Wisdom. Remember what Solomon said in Proverbs? The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. So if you're going to be a wise person, you consider God. The fool refuses to do that. And therefore his speech and his thinking do not reflect God in any way. And his speech, when he opens his mouth, not thinking about what's right to say, not thinking about God. And as Solomon puts it, it has a foolish start and ends up with a disastrous end. In fact, even when a fool goes to work, when he works, he gets so worn out that he doesn't even know the way to town. The idea here seems to be he can't even do the simplest thing. I like the way the Message put this. Peterson rendered it this way: a decent day's work so fatigues fools that they can't find their way back to town. Hendry commented that he would get lost, or to know how to go to the city would appear to have been a proverbial expression for practical wisdom or effective action. The fool could talk plenty, but he is incapable of action. And haven't you seen people like this? Oh, they've got advice for everything under the sun. Have they ever done it? Of course not. They're incapable of action themselves. Derek Kidner put it this way: he would get lost, we might say today, even if you put him on an escalator. So the picture begins to emerge of a man who makes things needlessly difficult for himself by his stupidity. To be ever learning, never arriving, as 2 Timothy 3:7 portrays some people, is to be a trifler who contrives to get lost on even the straightest way to the city. That is folly. That's foolishness, without even the excuse of ignorance. So there you have it, the foolish. And what's Solomon saying? He's saying it's not worth being a fool. Wisdom gives us far greater advantages. He then turns to give us a word about kings. Begins by saying, woe to the land when the king had been a servant. Now, your translation may have something different than that. The Hebrew word can be translated not only servant, it can be translated slave, by the way, or it could say when a king is a child, or when the king is childish, the Net Bible has. And the Hebrew word can reflect all those ideas there. But the idea seems to be that the king has not been brought up, he's not been prepared by noble birth to ascend to the throne. He's not been brought up to be king. He's not wisely trained and prepared to take the throne. So he says, woe to the land, because the princes take advantage, and they feast in the morning. Now, that may not make much sense to us, but I think the idea seems to be that they started feasting in the morning, and if you're aware of the feasts that they had back in this time period, they were more than just eating a meal. This was something that would go on for a day or several days. So in other words, they'd spend all day partying, never getting around to doing what they needed to be doing. And if they did, they wouldn't be in a state to do anything about it. Denny Petrillo said, his youth and inexperience lead him to make decisions and take actions that are detrimental to the land. Second, he and his princes feast in the morning. This shows a lack of good judgment. The wise man rises up early and gets to work, while the one who decides to feast most likely partakes of wine, dulling his senses. He is then unequipped to make the important decisions that need to be made throughout the course of the day. This kind of foolishness brings doom upon the land. The proper time for fun and relaxation is after the day's work has been done. When we're eating, we don't start with dessert. That comes at the end. When we get up in the morning, we don't start by relaxing and having fun. That's to take place after we finish our day's work. So woe to the land when the king had been a slave, but, he goes on, blessed is the land whose king is of noble birth. So the idea here seems to be that he's been raised wisely, and he knows what he needs to do, and he knows what to do. He has been brought up for this position. And the land is happy, because then the princes feast at the proper time. And they do it for the right reason. They don't do it to get drunk. They do it for nourishment. And so life continues the way it should. Solomon, at the end of this chapter, has some observations about life, and I think we'd agree with most of these, maybe not all of them. He starts off by saying that things aren't taken care of, they will get worse, and I think we would agree with that when we see a problem, we need to deal with it. Particularly, he talks about roofs here. If through laziness, he says, the roofers sag. So if the roof isn't dealt with when a problem is noticed, they'll start sagging. And of course, if we allow it to sag, of course, the house will leak, first of all, because of idle hands. The house leaks, he says. But of course, eventually the roof would cave in, wouldn't it? So I think he's just saying we need to take care of problems when we see them. He then gives 3 observations. I'm going to call them right now worldly observations. And these are these. A feast, he says, is made for laughter. Then when it's time to feast, it's time to enjoy yourself and have fun. He says, wine makes life merry. And then he says, and of course, money's the answer for everything. And I'm not sure we'd agree with all of those, but I think there may be a point to them. By the way, this last bit here, many commentators take the idea that what he's saying there is very cynical. And money's the answer to everything. And, there's a lot of people who do live with that idea in mind. Just make more money and we'll be happier. Or so we think. But Derek Kidner points out that maybe it isn't. Maybe he isn't being cynical here. He wrote, it need not be cynical. The point is not that every man has his price, but that every gift has its use. And silver, in the form of money, is the most versatile of all. God's wholesome gifts are good, and their proper use delightful and perfectly sufficient. So maybe Derek Kidner has the right idea. Maybe when he says that money is the solution to everything, he's just saying that, if we use the gifts we have, we can come up with some good solutions. That could be it. Of course, we realize that money isn't the solution to life, as much as many people live that way. If you remember back earlier in the book, he's already examined wealth and come to the conclusion that it too is meaningless, that it's a chasing after the wind. Now he ends by talking about what we say about those who are in authority over us. Watch what you say about the king. Now you might think, well, maybe he's a bit self-serving here. Maybe he is, because after all, who was the king when Solomon wrote this? Well, it was Solomon, wasn't it? But I think he has some good advice here, though. I think we can find some application for it. He says, even in your thoughts, don't think bad of the king. Don't revile the king. Or if you're in your most private place, your bedroom, don't curse the rich. And by the way, I think Solomon would put himself in that category with the rich, wouldn't he? One of the richest ever to live. Now, the reason he's not saying you can't criticize, although I think we probably do more criticizing than we need to do. What he's saying is be careful what you're doing. Even in a place you think is private, that nobody will hear you, he's telling us that a bird may carry your words to them. Now, I don't think he's really talking there about a bird literally hearing you and taking your word to the king to tell him what you're saying about them. But I think what he's telling us is that, as we often say, walls have ears. Someone will hear it, and someone will report what you're thinking. By the way, I think it would seem that the phrase, a little bird told me, originated from this verse. Thomas Hale wrote in the Applied Old Testament Commentary, a critical spirit is fatal to our well-being. If we nurture a critical spirit, some word will slip out, and we can be sure it will return to haunt us. Has that ever happened to you? Have you said something about somebody else? You thought it was in confidence, and you only told the one person, and yet the person you talked about it confronts you with it. Yes, we need to watch out being critical of others. And I think Solomon's advice is good. Be careful, a little bird may tell on you. So as we reach the conclusion of this particular section, Warren Wiersbe summarizes what's happened and what's going to happen in this way. He says Solomon has reviewed the 4 arguments presented in chapters 1 and 2 and has decided that life was really worth living after all. The best thing we can do is to trust God, do our work, accept what God sends us, and enjoy each day of our lives to the glory of God. All that remains for the preacher is to conclude his discourse with a practical application, and this he does in chapters 11 and 12. He will bring together all the various strands of truth that he has woven into his sermon, and he will show us what God expects us to do if we are to be satisfied. I think that's a pretty good summary of where we are. And we've seen the hints of the best thing to do is to trust God, do our work, accept what God sends us, and enjoy each day of our lives to God's glory. We've seen that in previous chapters. But we're going to see that especially in chapters 11 and 12 as he arrives at the conclusion of his search. What is it that makes life worth living? I think there are a number of lessons in addition to the ones we've already mentioned that we can see in chapter 10. I think coming through it in several places, we need to think before we act, think before we speak, so we don't do or say something foolish. And I think that's good advice for people at any time. But especially if we're a Christian, we need to watch what we say anyway. When somebody says something we don't like, don't respond in anger. Don't go off in a huff. Instead, we should maintain our composure. That will take the heat out of a situation very, very quickly. We also need to take time to prepare to do what we're going to do efficiently. Do the risk assessment so we can make sure we're doing it to the best that we can. And I think we can see that, and this has come through several places throughout Ecclesiastes. As we look at our lives, we live our lives, know when to work and know when to rest, and when to eat and when to relax and have fun. As he would say back in chapter 3, there's a time for everything under the sun. And even though the fool does believe that money is the answer to everything, I think we realize that wisdom tells us that money can present its own problems. And we've seen enough of that throughout our society, haven't we? Continue staying safe as we continue studying during this lockdown and as we're coming out of lockdown. If you can, please join us for chapters 11 and 12 as we continue to study through the book of Ecclesiastes as we're looking for what it is that makes life worth living. Thank you for joining us.